When I say basement, I mean really a basement, almost a cellar. There's a wooden hatch in the street, the fag end of Portobello Road by the Westway flyover, and down we go into a dingy space that becomes our home for a week. Well, hello to you both, and welcome back to New Musical Chairs, a post-punk podcast. I am your host, as always, Jay Cridford. This is episode 5, I am joined by Max Prior, Dorothy Max Prior. Now she is an artist, a writer, theatrical Jill of all trades, recently retired. Back then, she was a post-punk drummer for Rema-Rema, The Weekend Swingers, and Psychic TV. She was there at the birth of punk and Adam of the Ants, and the Monochrome Set. Can you believe that? She was a performer, an exotic dancer, and her fabulous book, 69 Exhibition Road, 12 True Life Tales from the Fag End of Punk, Porn, and Performance, is out now. We're going to be talking about that and everything else. And right now, she's going to let me get my breath back. Welcome, Max. How are you?
I'm all right. Yeah, where are you then? I'm in Brighton.
I am off the beaten path in Yorkshire. Out in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, God, yeah, I know that one.
Thank you very much for taking the time out to do this with me. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Going to be great.
Oh, pleasure. Yeah.
I picked up your book, 69 Exhibition Road, so obviously we'll talk about that. But, we can talk about Rema as well. I got into Rema a few years ago, but a lot has happened since then in the last sort of 4 or 5 years with that band. And so, and many other things too. So we'll probably end up kind of jumping all over the place in time, moving back and forth.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, thank you for doing this. Really looking forward to this. And so, really and truly, I think perhaps the best place to start would be to talk about literature, talk about the book, and the times that invokes, 69 Exhibition Road. It's a fantastic read for anybody who wants to get into the mindset and the climate of punk London and post-punk London. But it's one of many, isn't it? Because there are a lot of books that have come out in a very short space of time, really in the last year and a half, that have explored this period, the birth of Gothic and post-punk in the UK and around the world. There's been, John Robb's put out The Art of Darkness, and Cathy Unsworth has done Season of the Witch. Lowell Tolhurst has done a book. Why the fascination now, do you think, all of a sudden?
I think in a way it's a natural progression from all the interest in punk. We had all the sort of 40 years of and whatever, and then a whole load of things like the Viv Albertine book and obviously lots and lots and lots and lots of autobiographies and memoirs of the punk days that just went on and on and on for quite a while. And I suppose it was just it was just a natural progression that people would then move on to the 80s. I mean, I'm writing a book about the 80s at the moment, so I'm at it as well. We're all at it. And Simon Price, I don't know if you know Simon Price, music critic, who used to be with The Independent, now Independent. He's written Curipedia, which is apparently going to be, or is the definitive book about The Cure, which is Encyclopedia Britannica of post-punk. So there's a lot, yeah.
I actually didn't know that was in the works, I'm going to have to check that out.
Yeah, I'm going to do a sort of record store in-store, book talky kind of thing with
fantastic.
Him and John Robb in Brighton in November.
That'll be brilliant. John's really been getting about, hasn't he, recently, since The Art of Darkness came out?
Oh, which is good. He's very, he's a very proactive and, kind of forward thinking and forward moving sort of person.
He really is, yeah. And the brief interactions I've had with John over the years, and they have been very small, his passion is unwavering and really infectious, and I think he was well placed to do that.
Yeah, he's published that book himself and really promoted it really well. I mean, it's done very well.
It has, and rightly so too. And it's no mean feat because it's a long book. There are certainly a few sections, having read it, that I felt could have been pruned a little bit, but it's a great read, and I think a vital document of that time. You know, the prevalent thoughts and feelings of the people who were there, the origins of some of the themes expressed in the music then, and I think many people criticism I've read would say that period's already been done to death. And I tend to disagree, actually. A lot of vital artists get skimmed
Hmm.
over, and more's always better, right?
It's amazing, actually. I've been doing all the kind of book tour thing for the whole of this year. And I've actually been quite kind of astonished to discover that there is this whole circuit of festivals. Well, either festivals that are just dedicated to books about music, little niche, or within festivals like Rebellion, there's a very healthy kind of literary stage. And you kind of think, God, there's so many books out there. You go into somewhere like Rough Trade, and there's just tables and tables and shelves, all these books. You think, my God, is there room in the world for any more? And then, there is. I mean, I was worried when I published 69 Exhibition Road. I was thinking, oh God, timing, because my dear friend Jordan, who sadly died, she had her book written with Kathy, Defying Gravity, come out, just which I contributed to, which came out not long before mine. Obviously, the Vival Team books, the Cozy Fanny Tutti, there's a lot of crossover. We all know each other, and there was a lot of crossover in stories. But, actually, the books are all really different. We all, even the same incidents that get told, we've all got our own different take on them. And people who are just really, they actually like the crossover between the books. They're like, you get people asking in the sort of post show, whatever, the Q&A thing, people going, I was really interested that you said such and such, and Cozy said such and such, and what do you think about this? And they're just really interested in in the dialogue that's set up, addressing the same time or the same incident.
It's funny, because my dad says now that how old are you, Dad? 63. 63 years behind him now. He and my uncle will remember the same event completely differently. And,
Yeah,
somewhere in between both of them, there's
yeah.
a grain of truth.
And the other thing is that it's not just that different people remember things differently. I mean, I remember things differently now to how I remember them 10 years ago or whatever, or at least I choose to highlight different things. Something becomes more important to you either because the culture has changed or because you've changed.
And that leads us neatly into talking about 69 Exhibition Road, 12 True Life Tales from the Fag End of Punk, Porn and Performance. It's a fabulous book, Max. It really
Thank
is.
you.
I read it very, very quickly. I think I shot through it in a weekend, which is really unlike me, I've got to say. I absolutely loved it.
Oh,
I found myself really engrossed in it, and it's interesting what you've just said about memory because um, I won't read all of this, but the intro to the book really sets that narrative up and sets up the expectation, I suppose, that things are going to be a little bit liquid. And this is just, I'm not going to read all of this, but it's so visual and tactile. It's just really beautiful. An old couple, at least 60 they are standing outside reading the menu. He's wearing a camel-coloured Crombie coat and black velvet collar. He has a proper gentleman's shoes and is nicely polished. There's something slightly racy about him, but it's hard to say what. She's a little more showy. She has hennaed hair and ruby red lipstick, but what was she wearing? I can't really remember. Does it matter? It doesn't matter. Not too much, I suppose, but it's been bothering me. Why do I remember some things so clearly? What somebody was wearing, what somebody else said decades ago, and not others. If, like Christopher Isherwood, I am a camera, then I am a malfunctioning CCTV blinking on and off, capturing moments randomly and placing them into storage. Why is that at the start of the book?
yeah. No, it's yeah, the kind of intro and the outro, the sort of bookends of the book, because the outro, well, as you know, is a bit with Andy and I rifling through all our old possessions, 40 years on to try and for me to kind of gather things up for an installation piece I'm making. Yeah, I felt it needed something to bookend the stories. And the thing about that intro is I just wanted to be upfront about the way memory works, or the way my memory works anyway, and just to be honest about the fact that sometimes we have to invent the truth. We have to just kind of go, God, she's got to be, as I say in that piece, she's got to be wearing something. Let's put her in this, And sometimes you just have to do that because the text, it's there in that intro, but if you were to do that throughout the whole book, just keep saying, "Oh, I can't quite remember," and who, it just would become cumbersome. So you've just got to acknowledge right up front that sometimes you miss things out, or change something, or just take a guess at something because you're not remembering everything. And of course, nobody remembers everything. Otherwise, we'd be living in real time.
It's wonderfully meta, and actually, it reminds me of one of my favourite short story writers, the American author Raymond Carver, in that the admission of fault in memory or gaps in memory can actually colour things in a different way, because it's something everybody can relate to, because we all do it, and it's how we perceive our experiences, isn't it?
It's an honesty as well, isn't it, about the text and about the nature of writing text. I mean, I also, amongst many other hats that I wear, I sometimes teach creative writing, and I have a course that's on non-fiction narrative and memoir writing, and I call that course "Inventing the Truth." I actually stole that phrase from the title of a book I had years and years ago, but I love that phrase. I love the phrase "inventing the truth" because actually you're fashioning a text. That's the thing you have to remember, and it's just okay. Yes, you're trying to tell quote unquote your truth, as people say these days. You are trying to capture something that's real. You are publishing it as non-fiction, not fiction. That is a conscious choice. And actually, I've had this discussion. I've sometimes done things in tandem with Dave Barb, the Ants Bow Wow Wow drummer. Done a few things together, and because he's chosen to write fiction and I've chosen to write non-fiction, and we're often writing about the same time and the same things, we've had interesting discussions with the audience joining in about those choices, about why you choose one path rather than the other. So yeah, I've chosen the non-fiction path, but it is with an awareness that we nevertheless have to kind of edit and craft, and we don't remember everything. It's still a text that's being molded.
So, in terms of that title, 69 Exhibition Road, it's obviously where you lived at that time, and so that places the narrative within a particular locale, but it also has other things tied to it, because you had quite a different life, didn't you, up until that point? So why was that the title?
Yeah, it's so for anyone who's not London literate, 69 Exhibition Road is a road in South Kensington that runs from South Kensington Station up to the Royal Albert Hall. Very wide avenue. It was actually built, so people could get to the Royal Albert Hall. It's a specifically built street. And it's full of museums. It's where the Science Museum is, and the V&A, and the Natural History Museum. And we lived in this like big old rundown house. It's 4 or 5 stories high, full of like mice and everything kind of falling apart. And it was a house through which a lot of people passed. A lot of people involved in punk either passed because they lived there for a while, or passed because they were hanging out with us or with other people that lived in the house. It wasn't a squat. It was all divided up into bed sits, each with their little kind of Yale lock. And I think it's possibly it probably sounds quite odd and improbable to someone of your generation that South Kensington and Notting Hill and all of these areas, they were so run down. I mean, there was the grand buildings that still survived. Obviously South Kensington's got all of those museums and the Albert Hall and a lot of really grand buildings, and it has embassies and everything. But it's also, where Polanski's film Repulsion was filmed, which I quote in the book. It was just street after street of really rundown housing that was split into bedsits. Yeah, it ended up, the book ended up being called that because most of the stories do centre around the time that I lived there, between 1976 and 1982. There's a little bit sort of at the beginning, there's a story or two at the very beginning of the book that are pre-69 Exhibition Road, which I did kind of question myself about including, because I thought, okay, I'm not sure if I'm being sort of pedantic about this, but maybe all the stories should just literally be when I was living in 69 Exhibition Road. But then I kind of felt, it was kind of quite nice to have, you might have noticed that one story is actually in a different narrative voice. It's in the second person, which was again something I did. Then I thought, come on, this is perhaps a bit pretentious or a bit odd, and it feels strange. So I changed it into the normal memoir first person, same as the rest of the book. And then I reread it and I didn't like it like that. And sometimes you do things instinctively and then it takes you ages to work out. It's like the same with making music, isn't it? Or painting or anything really. You do things instinctively and they're the right thing, but because you can't justify it to yourself or to someone else, you have to kind of deconstruct it and work out why did you do that. So I wasted a lot of time. Spent a lot of time actually transposing it into the first person, the same as the rest of the book. And then going, now this isn't right. And why is this not right? And it's because I felt myself to be a different person then. Because there is something, if you believe in this sort of thing, about the 7-year cycles and age 21 and the coming of age. Like I can really remember being 21, 22, 23, and I just feel myself. I feel exactly, obviously lots and lots of different things have happened in my life, but I still relate to that person as myself. But when I remember myself as like 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, actually it's like remembering someone else, which is why I chose to address that person, that 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old in that story as you, because she is a you. She's not me somehow.
Because you mentioned your creative writing course earlier on, because you actually did go to teach training college, didn't you, before this?
Yeah.
And you were also involved in dance from an early age, is that right?
Yeah, dance and writing have basically always just gone kind of hand in hand, hand in foot, whatever. Yeah, well, as I say in the book, I went to teach training college because that's what bright working class girls do. Yeah, I was the first person in my family. Well, my parents both left school at 14 and were both working class origins. So my dad was a car mechanic and my mum was a waitress. And so they hadn't had any education beyond the age of 14. So it's quite a thing. And we thought it was the dawn of a new age, a marvelous new age. It turns out we were this strange blip, which I'm ashamed of this country to say this, but we were the strange blip. We were the generation of working class people who could go into higher education because we not only didn't have to pay fees, we actually got support towards paying rent and things like that. So this actually completely changed things. You suddenly had a whole load of people who could. So yeah, I did teacher training, but I kind of dropped out in the second year because I realised it wasn't what I wanted to do. But I kind of came back to teaching in other ways, not in schools, but so much as teaching adults later on.
Tell me about Timmy, because he was by all accounts a rather extraordinary looking person, and kind of acted as your entree perhaps into the gay scene in London at the time. Tell me how meeting him changed things for you, began to shape you.
Timmy looked very, very kind of Bowie-like, sort of very, very pale, very skinny, very pale skin, sort of androgynous, beautiful, hennaed hair, jewelry, a fur coat and silver platform shoes and, the rest of it. So yeah, I met him at a dance class. It was it was at the Cockpit Theatre. It was an experimental dance workshop. The dance group and the electronic music people, we were brought together by the director of the Cockpit to create something together. Of course, it terrified me at the time, the idea of like avant-garde music and dancing barefoot and all the rest of it to screechy sounds. And so that's where I met Timmy. And yeah, through Timmy, discovered all the gay clubs and went out on the town, and we just became like twins that couldn't be separated for a year or two.
It's funny because, well, it's not funny. Reading the book and learning a little bit more about the gay scene in London at the time, there was phenomenal prejudice back then, and it feels very current.
I feel exactly the same. It's frightening that it's all, the infighting.
Yeah, and some of the bits you mentioned, it just reminded me. We could talk about the ongoing war of nerves between TERFs and trans people, and it just made me realise, gosh, we were there then, and we're still there now.
And
Here we are.
I thought we'd got over that.
So did I.
We'd moved on, and the names were different. We didn't use I mean, people perhaps called themselves drag queens or transvestites rather than trans people, and certainly the term, the acronym TERF hadn't been invented. Radical lesbian, separatist, feminist, whatever, or some combination of those words. But yeah, exactly as you say, these people are in this corner. I mean, my radical feminist flatmates, that I lived with were very disapproving of me hanging out with, drag queens and boys that wore makeup and things like that, because they just saw it as sort of sullying the women's movement, and the fight was being kind of sullied by all of this nonsense by these people that were, pretend women. Yeah. And here we go again.
There's a naivety too that with the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, gay people were suddenly emancipated, but there were still ridiculous restrictions on them, not being able to cohabit with each other, for
Oh,
example.
yeah, well, that's why now the wording is very careful, isn't it? Where we now talk about partial, or how, it's phrased as partial decriminalisation. Rather, it's not suddenly that homosexuality is legal, as it was often stated at the time. Yeah, as you say, you couldn't. I mean, you could be accused of running a gay brothel if you had male friends in the house who were having sex in the other room. You could actually be accused of running a gay brothel.
It's ridiculous to me that this is even a conversation. It beggars belief that we are saying these things out loud, and this is still a thing.
Yeah, yeah, and then yeah. There's we can see all sorts of, certainly in other countries and even this country to some extent, we can see that despite the progress and the fact that gay marriage is now legal and blah blah blah, we still have extraordinary prejudice.
Yeah, it's very sad. We'll get there one day, I'm sure, but there's still a long way to go. But one of the many things the book did for me was painted the picture of London so beautifully around that time. Having spoken to my parents about this, who grew up there, set the scene for the listeners about what London was like. I think of somewhere like Docklands, for example, which is as far removed from what it is today then as it could be.
Yes. Well, London was and still is to some extent, but it was very, very clear then was a series of kind of villages and separate places, with very different vibes. The centre of London things have really shifted now because people live in places like Croydon or Cockfosters and describe it as London, whereas I'd see that as living in the suburbs, really, not London. The London of the 1970s was 3-day weeks and bin strikes and electricity kind of loads of electricity cuts and complete mayhem politically. Again, when I found a few years ago when I was writing the book, it seemed like I was writing about a very strange, distant time. And actually what's happened in the last 5 years since I sort of wrote that down, is actually we're progressing stroke regressing to a London that has got a lot of kind of similarities, with just mess and chaos. But yeah, the one thing though that it did have, well, both London and New York at the time had a lot of spaces that artists could use in the sort of centre. So Covent Garden was completely run down, Unity Gardens behind corrugated iron, with just like flowers growing and the what's now the Covent Garden Market, which is sort of thriving, loads of clothes stores and all the rest of it. I mean, that was just a closed down fruit and veg market, which, the pigeons were occupying. And there were buskers there and things, but it was like, now it's all very kind of official and organized, whereas there it was just people doing a bit of busking, So yeah, a lot of places have changed beyond recognition. Soho was always very mixed, very kind of run down, but with upmarket restaurants at the same time. Yeah, and Chelsea was another kind of little, there were these little oases of areas that people hung out at and where all the kind of more, hip sort of clothes and record shops and things were. Camden was, there was a few shops and things, but there was Camden Lock Market, but it hadn't really hit it as a place to be, because there is this real kind of changeover that happens in the early 80s where people suddenly start going to Camden as much, if not more, as they do. It's money. Again, it's the same old reasons. What happened is that Soho just became too too expensive with the property boom of the same property boom that saw me being kind of bought out of this flat in Exhibition Road so that it could be redeveloped. There was just in the early 80s masses of redevelopment over London. So you did suddenly have a situation where people that were running, all the little kind of hip little clothes and record shops and art galleries and all that sort of thing in places like Soho, they were just pushed out because of the rent. So they had to find somewhere else. So they went to the kind of, the next ring of London, which was places like Camden and Fulham and Wandsworth and all of these sort of places, which at the time were quite on the edges,
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about the counterculture a little bit because it's interesting talking about this, reading the stories in the book. It's interesting from my vantage point as somebody who was born in 1990, and you mentioned hindsight before. A lot of these events, a lot of these bands and people almost don't feel real in some strange way. And now, recently many of these bands are getting back together, are doing tours, putting new records out, and all of a sudden you can have a drink with them at the bar or talk to them at the merchandise stand, which is a a neat little thing for somebody like me, I guess. But anyway, I always think that counterculture is obviously a reflection of and a reaction to the status quo of the time, the establishment. So we mentioned what was going on in London, the poverty, unemployment, Thatcher's government coming in. Set the scene for me about for the counterculture because you were there when punk was beginning to come up and when things darkened musically as well and became post-punk and then goth.
Well, I think for a lot of us that were there, if you like, in the early days, the first wave of punk, even before it was called punk, it was kind of over by 1977, 1978. I mean, for Mark P, who ran Sniffing Glue, that for him, everyone has got their own moment of, when punk died. For him, the Clash signing to CBS was the death. Everyone knows the Sex Pistols were, Malcolm McLaren, they were just kind of playing situationist game, or so Malcolm claimed, so signing to major record companies and then taking the money and run, it felt, it might not have been quite masterminded in the way that McLaren later claimed, but it feels fitting. But the Clash, who always proclaim themselves to be, politically motivated, for them to sign to CBS, a lot of people saw that as absolute letdown. It was just unacceptable, and the death of punk. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Glenn Matlock leaving the Pistols. I never saw the Sex Pistols with Sid Vicious and the whole Sid and Nancy thing and the whole way Sid was marketed, that just seemed like, okay, it's all gone a step too far and this is nothing to do with any of us anymore. So that was around the time that we were forming Rema-Rema in 1978. Marco, who was in Rema-Rema, was a really good friend of Sid's at some point. But by then they weren't, he wasn't seeing him at all, wasn't speaking to him. Marco was just felt the same way I did, that it had all gone really, really stupid. So yeah, post-punk was sort of happening at the time that a lot of people feel punk was happening.
I suppose for me, and it would be great to get your take on this, because obviously Marco from Rema-Rema knew Sid, and he'd been in the Banshees for a minute, and he'd been really kind of active and in there at the start of all this stuff. And I suppose, the narrative around Sid and Nancy, and sadly the reality, and what was going on at a wider level, things were beginning to darken. Do you think that's why the bands and the musicians that were coming up slightly after that began to splinter and began to reach out for and kind of escape the trappings of the rock and roll four-chord mantra that the Pistols embodied?
I think with Rema-Rema, Marco and Michael Allen Mick had been in a band called the Models that had played, the Roxy and things like that. But they were quite clear by the end of 1977. They were kind of quite clear that they'd really had enough of just sounding or trying to sound like other people, and wanted to create something new. And I think in our very different ways. I think there were quite a few of us, dotted around the country. Obviously, there's Rema-Rema in London. There was also alternative TV in London who are doing all sorts of different things with sound. I mean, there was the whole Throbbing Gristle, etc. But they're in a way they're on their own trajectory that's slightly different, although they ended up being considered as part of the rock music, if you want to call it. But originally, it was kind of a performance art thing. Not, you had Human League and Cabaret Voltaire and people like that. So yeah, there was just, and people were going their different sort of routes with it, really. I mean, I was the last one to join Rema-Rema, and the others always said that they originally had intended to use a drum machine, and then for whatever reason they decided not to, and to have a kind of live drummer. And in the Rema-Rema documentary film, which is called What You Could Not Visualise, which came out last year, Mark Cox, when he's the keyboard player, when he's interviewed in that, he says, oh, it was partly because Cabaret Voltaire and the Human League were both using drum machines that, as he put it, we decided we wouldn't, So sometimes you're defining yourself in contradiction to what someone else was doing.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to go into all of that in a second, Max. But just to take a quick diversion, Throbbing Gristle, what did you think of because they do get lumped in with this, with post-punk a lot, and electronic and synth and so on. And I group them that way because I'm removed from the time. But what did you think of them when they first appeared? Because they seemed to come out of nowhere, and their approach was wholly their own. And I'm really curious to kind of...
Well, they came out of a performance art troupe, which is their company. They'd started in Hull and moved down to London. And when they did the prostitution exhibition at the ICA that I was involved with putting on, I mean, just as a kind of dog's body helping out in the ICA and gallery and things. But when they did that, they performed as Throbbing Gristle at the opening party for their exhibition.
Yeah.
And I think most people that were there, there was the whole punk lot who were there. And I think they were just like, oh God, what's this? And most weren't interested at all. And then there were the kind of art people there who just saw it as an art prank.
Yeah.
Some sort of kind of trickster thing. Now, that's what I thought I was going to witness.
Right.
That's what I was expecting. But then I was actually really surprised to find that they were doing something that was actually really, really interesting musically. And I'd just coincidentally, due to other influences, had recently been discovering things like Varese and Mimorolio and I don't know, and sort of John Cage and various other kind of, Walt and now Wendy Carlos. And I'd just been spending quite a lot of time discovering electronic music. So I did have this response where I was actually surprised by what I was witnessing, because I was expecting to be witnessing something that was just a joke or a piss take or whatever. But actually I found it really, really interesting music.
Oh, absolutely. And thinking about this, listening to some of those early Gristle records again, I would love to try and speak to Cozy on here, because they were obviously... her and Chris were building their own effects. They would take something like a guitar, try and make it sound not like a guitar, and that is so punk, It's like the sound doesn't exist. Let's find a way of making it, And it's the ethos, isn't it?
DIY ethos that was actually driving the kind of art movement that ended up being tagged as punk, but there was actually a lot of things concurrently happening that were all around the idea of a DIY ethos and actually making things happen, not waiting for permission, not waiting to be told how to do things. I mean, I think unlike some people who are more just doing things in their bedroom, it is worth acknowledging that, I mean, a lot of the technical know-how in Throbbing Gristle is coming from Chris Carter, who was working for the BBC at the time as one of their top sound engineers or sound designers and whatever. He did all that. He did massive outside broadcasts and all sorts of things. His knowledge of how sound is reproduced and how sound works, electronic sound works, was massive. So
it's funny because now that I think about it, take a band like Current 93 and David Tibet and those early records that they did or he did, who I love. Some of the sounds on those early industrial records sound or feel very accidental, whereas the Gristle stuff and what Chris was doing feel very deliberate. And I actually didn't know that about Chris, and that makes a whole lot of sense now that you've said that to me. Really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of knowledge there, so there's a lot of obviously Jen kind of was very much the spokesperson and the front person for the band, and people often think of Throbbing Gristle. They often, when I'm asked about my knowledge of relationships with Throbbing Gristle, it's because what people always want to know is what was Genesis really like, and how was your relationship with Jen, and people just very much focus on that. But yeah, I think for anyone who's really interested in music, genuinely interested in the whole the whole soundscape of that Throbbing Gristle created, then I think the for me the key factor is Chris. I think Chris is the essence of the band. But I mean, obviously it's four people, and four of them made an amazing combination, actually created absolutely wonderful things together, and I think they've all inputted in their different ways.
Naturally.
Yeah.
So let's get to Rema-Rema. Let's talk about how Rema-Rema formed, and we should probably go back as well a little bit and talk about how you started to play drums, because I believe it involved Andy and a young man called Stuart Leslie Goddard.
Yeah. So I started playing drums because I was invited to be the drummer in a band that had no name at the time, and I'd met these two young men. They're only about 18, called Andy and Bid. And they had a sort of Velvet's influence band, which I think is probably why they fancied the idea of a female drummer.
Sure.
And so they invited me to be the drummer in the band, basically. And I just said to them, well, I don't play drums and I don't have a drum kit. And they were like, well, so yeah. So I joined. At the time, the band had at one point it had three singers. It had my friend Monica, who was the conduit, if you like, because she's German. Monica, it was her bedroom in 69 Exhibition Road that I was sleeping on the floor of at the time when I met Andy and Bid. So she was, again, I think because of their sort of Velvet's obsession, having a German female occasional or guest singer was a plus. And then there was this other guy called Stuart, who was an art school student and very, sort of self-effacing in a lumberjack shirt and, glasses and things like that, who also brought along a few songs. And after a few rehearsals, it became really clear that Stuart and Bid, who were the main songwriters, were just on a completely different kind of paths with the sort of music that they wanted to do. So Stuart decided that he would reinvent himself, and he wanted to kind of change his name and change his whole image and everything. So he re-emerged into the world as Adamant, and he kind of spirited Andy away with him to form the Ants. The rest of us stayed as what would become the Monochrome Set, although it wasn't called that then. I didn't last very long, but yeah. So Bid formed Monochrome Set, Adam formed the Ants, and that was. And the band sort of split into two. Now, it wasn't quite as straightforward as that, because over the next couple of years, there was an awful lot of kind of toing and froing.
Right.
Lester Square was the original guitarist in the Ants, but he didn't even make it to the first public gig. He retreated back and ended up playing in the Monochrome Set with Bid. Andy did, the first couple of years of the original Ants, and then after the Dirt Wears White Socks album, left and went back to work with Bid, who he had been friends with since they were both like 12 or something, So, and they're still together. They're still playing the Monochrome Set.
They certainly are. Yeah, I saw them last year.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah, and I've got to say as well, just as a diversion here, Dirt Wears White Socks by Adamant and the first Monochrome Set album, Strange Boutique, are just brilliant albums. Perfect post-punk documents from that time.
Oh, I'm glad you like them. Yeah.
Love them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk Rema-Rema. That all came about through an advert from Marco, right?
It was a regular music press, probably Melody Maker or something. because that's what people did. Yeah, I just met up with them, and that was it. Joined.
What were your inspirations then in terms of putting the music together? Because when you listen to it now, there's a lot of different disparate stuff in there.
Well, that was, I think, for me, that's what made Rema-Rema special. Is I think the combination of people and the combination of influences was. I mean, it was a broad church, and it's also sort of, sorry, jumping forward to the end of Rema-Rema.
No problem.
Whilst
Yeah.
we're talking about the beginning, but the reason I did sort of stay for a really short while after Marco left.
Right.
But for me, the whole sound of it, without Marco's guitar,
Yeah.
it didn't kind of, for me, work, because it just went into something else that was not as exciting or interesting. So I think this particular the fact that we had two vocalists, the fact that we had this really extraordinary guitarist, the fact that we had Mark on synthesizer and organ just trying out all sorts of interesting sounds, the fact that we had the bass up front as the lead instrument, the mixed bass, and that the bass and the drums just went together and were often really up front in what we were doing. We're often physically, we often positioned ourselves. I mean, there's certain things you can and can't do, obviously, because of kind of feedback and PAs and things like that. But we often had a kind of sound that was driven by the bass and the drums just keeping things going, and then which just freed up the others to kind of weave around, really. So we were influenced by people like Kraftwerk and Can and Neu and all of the German new wave.
I can hear a bit of Armandul too in there as well.
Yeah, all of that.
Phallus Day.
But there's also the kind of funky guitar riffs and bass riffs that were coming from an interest in things like Bootsy Collins and Parliament and all of that. So that was the kind of shared territory. We all had a bit of a soft spot for glam rock, particularly Marco. But we all had things we liked there, and obviously things like Velvets and whatever. But I think it's just this kind of mixture of things from all over the place, really.
Yeah, because the songs feel so chaotic, but they're very attractive in that, like everything could splinter at any moment. And I'm really curious as to how you got the songs together. Did you have a set goal that you went for, or was it just, was it pure self-expression?
Well, we were making those songs in the rehearsal / recording studio for like 6 months before we played live.
Yeah.
So, which was partly design and partly non-design. I mean, we just didn't know where we were going to play. We didn't want to play support to people. We didn't want to play the normal rock venues. We were just waiting for the right things to come up. But I think we also were waiting for a time that we felt happy with what we were doing. We were quite happy playing just for the five of us, just doing it for our own sakes, actually, for quite a long time, really working on getting a sound that we wanted, just taking it really slowly. So we did a lot of all-nighters in this place called Halligan's, which was on oh gosh, I've written it down in the book and now I can't remember. Read the book and you'll find out where. I think it's either Caledonian Road or it's near Archway anyway.
I'll drop it in here in the edit. No one will ever know. It is Caledonian Road, by the way.
Anyway, Halligan's, which rehearsal studio in Archway. We were just given the keys by Mr. Halligan, Tony Halligan, and just used to stay in there all night. Would be there like for 8 hours or whatever. And we might just start off just messing around, playing like maybe me and Mick doing a bass and drum thing, and then someone else just joining in over the top. Sometimes it was a more conventional start with somebody coming in, like Marco coming, or Mick. Marco and Mick were the more likely ones to come in with something resembling a song or an idea for a song. So yeah, or Gary maybe had a lyric that wanted to explore. And we had these sort of two singers, Gary and Mick both singing. So that's another thing that I liked about the sound, the fact that you had these two very different voices. Yeah, so often the sounds were kind of sculpted, over just doing things. I mean, I suppose because we never actually made a proper studio album. I mean, when 4AD released all that stuff in 2019, it was kind of slightly it was marketed in a slightly odd way as the kind of lost for Rema-Rema album, as if it's been made and put in a vault and now just found. And it wasn't at all. It was just that it's all cobbled together, from things from rehearsals or live gigs, or we did do, one recording session but not, it was, a self-made studio, not a studio. We had a TX 4-track and a basement in Notting Hill and Portobello Road, and we went in and worked out how to use it. Marco did mostly, I think, and made some demos so that we could play to people, and all ended up on an album 40 years later. But it's not, it's not a studio album.
Yeah, and I want to touch on Fond Reflections in a little bit. But tell me about how Ivo Watts Russell and 4AD came into the situation and how you made Wheel and the Roses.
Well, we were first in discussion with Peter Kent, who worked for Beggars Banquet, and Peter really liked us. But the way he put it to us was that he had this mate called Ivo who really wanted to start a record label, and they were going to do it together. And it was going to be all the things that weren't quite right for Beggars Banquet that were the things that Ivo was really, and he were really, inspired by. So in fact, we were the first signing to 4AD, although because of delays, I think our record didn't come out. It didn't come out as like the number one release, but we were the first signing. And Ivo said, which he repeats in the documentary about Rema-Rema, that when he heard us, he thought, this is exactly what I want 4AD to be. This is what I want it to do. And how the record came about was it was actually, there were 3 tracks that were actually recorded for another record company. And that whole relationship had fallen apart. But we did actually have the tracks, or at least I acquired them. I just went and got like 20 quid or something, something.
Nice.
So we did actually have this stuff that had been recorded in Pathway Studio with Wally Brill engineering. He wasn't he wasn't actually credited as producer because we wanted to self-produce it, but he was a producer to all intents and purposes. He was, he was great. He was just a really fantastic engineer, and he really knew what to do with things. So some of the tracks, the one side of the record is 2 out of the 3 tracks. There was the 3rd track, so Feedback Song and Rema-Rema were studio recorded, and then on the other side is some live tracks. And then the other song that I was just so disappointed didn't make it onto Wheel and the Roses, because it was actually my favourite Rema-Rema song, was Entry. And that there's all sorts of reasons why that wasn't included. There was a synth that was a bit out of time, but probably more pertinently, there was blasphemy that nobody wanted to handle.
Tell me about that cover, Max, because that cover has almost become, in a way, almost as if not more iconic than the record itself, because it's so quite innocuous if you were to pick it out of a record rack, and yet there's intrigue and there's mystery there, and it just seems the perfect record cover for the time.
I don't know if nowadays it would happen, because it might be seen as cultural appropriation or something like that to have an image in a white. I don't know. I'm just thinking in 21st century, 2023 sort of terms. I'm just musing on the fact that it might not happen now, because we might have second thoughts about whether that's appropriate. But it was basically Michael Allen, who it's a National Geographic image. He just loved the image, and he just it was his suggestion, and we just went with it. It was an odd time, because we were actually split up at the time when we no longer existed, and yet we had this we had this record coming out even though we didn't exist. But I think Nick just presented the idea to us, and it's his idea to paint the little red rose on the black and white photo. And just for the record, 4AD did actually get sued years later by National Geographic for using the record without paying, and they had to pay them. But by then, 4AD had the money to do that, so that was right.
That was all right, yeah. Tell me about Fond Reflections then, and how that came about, because I do remember the marketing around that it was this mythical lost album that, we've opened the vaults and here it is. But what was the reality?
Well, that had a lot to do with the perseverance of Gary, who had been releasing various bits of Rema-Rema stuff on his own label, Le Coq Musique, and he really suggested simultaneously to 4AD and to the rest of the band. Years and years later, he just sort of suggested that maybe it'd be a good idea to get some of this stuff out. And of course, the technology had shifted, so although it still got that kind of rough and ready sound, it was possible to take some of the worst. Sometimes things like cassette tape hiss is really nice, but there's certain things that would just needed to be done for it to be a quote unquote proper record. So yeah. I think Gary really pushed it all forward and did the liaising between 4AD and the rest of us. Mark Cox physically had a lot of the tapes and things in a cupboard, which he'd sort of dug out. So, yeah.
So in spite of the way it was marketed, what do you think of it now?
I really like it, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
That's cool. No, it's
I mean,
it's
as
fantastic.
I said a minute ago, I've always really loved Entry, so I was just so pleased that I finally saw the light of day as a proper, released on a proper record. Yeah, because it was just my favourite Rema song. So I was just really delighted that come out. Some of them I kind of almost some tracks I'm like less familiar with. I mean I vaguely remember playing them, but yeah, I'm a bit like, oh yeah, that one.
So, obviously, there's the documentary as well, What You Could Not Visualise, directed by Marco Porsia. Also did a fantastic documentary on the band Swans. So tell me a little bit, Max, about how that came about and what you thought of that. We're also going to hear from Marco about the impetus for this documentary.
So the idea for the Rema-Rema film kind of got in my head after 4AD released the Fond Reflections album, which contained everything they had ever done, put to tape, rehearsal tapes, demos, and everything that did not see the light of day 40 years earlier. And that's when we got to hear how incredible what they had done, back then was, and that no one had ever heard. So I thought there was a potential to a really interesting story about a band kind of lost to time.
Lost to time is right for Rema-Rema, absolutely. But I feel they left an indelible mark. And Marco, to want to commit to creating a feature-length documentary on a band that existed for a very short period of time and actually only had one official release to their name, there must have been something about Wheel in the Roses and Rema-Rema to you that has kind of sustained and that you've carried with you all these years, because why why on earth would you make a documentary about an insignificant band? You wouldn't.
When I did buy Wheel and the Roses, I mean, at that time, being a young teenager, it's that period when you're most vulnerable and happy to discover music. And I always believed that the music you discover back then, around the time when you're like those teenage years, is the one that you're always going to hold dearest to you.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it from Marco there. And actually, I have the same feeling. My favourite band, The Church, Australian psychedelic band, also from the post-punk era. These bands leave an indelible mark on us, and there's a reason for that. And I think that is when you discover them. Because like Marco said, it's the time you're most susceptible and sensitive to these things. Matt, if we think about it, what did you think when Marco first approached you? It's a feature-length documentary for a band that there's no live footage of. You didn't exist for a very long time. What did you think? What thoughts occurred to you? And did you think it was possible to do that? How did he approach you?
Well, he emailed one or other of us, who then passed it on to the others. How did we feel? Well, at first I thought, oh God, well, good luck, mate, because there's no live footage. It just seemed a bit of a kind of strange quest. I couldn't really see how he was going to go about it. Then he did all the interviews with us. And for me, the turning point actually is when I saw the Swans film. I saw it in Brighton, when it came down here, and Marco was over. In fact, it was the day that he interviewed me for the Rema-Rema film. He just sort of said, "Oh, if you're free this afternoon, this Swans film I did is at the Comedia." And I'll be honest and say I've never been a massive Swans fan.
Right.
I think it's just because I never saw them live, and
Sure.
I just think it's not something I ever got kind of into.
The live was a massive part of the experience.
So I went along and saw the Swans film at Comedia, and I absolutely loved the film. And it kind of made me interested in Swans and interested in the story. And I thought, well, that's the sign of a good filmmaker, because if you can get somebody who's not particularly interested in something to be interested in it through. With Swans, there is live footage, so it wasn't quite such a difficult quest. But he used a lot of the kind of tricks in that film that he then used with Rema-Rema, which is using little kind of bits of animation and kind of photo montage and other visual effects to create a visual landscape. So it's not just all kind of talking heads or whatever.
Started doing the interviews with other band members in 2019 when I was over in London for the Swans premiere. So it was a sort of continuation, after Swans, I went right into Rema-Rema and then kind of broadened the scope. But it was important for me to hear their story. And I didn't really even know if there was going to be, a story there when I started, or a film. So but that was the exciting part, just kind of discovering as well myself many things that I didn't know, and yeah, that's how I went about it, and just kind of little by little. And then of course then COVID hit, so I had to pause and take a break from the film, even though I had already some interviews and had started editing a story. And then after the sanctions were lifted, and as soon as I could, I really went all out in 2022 to try and finish the film.
From then on, I helped Marco Porsia in any way that he wanted, because I suddenly felt that absolute confidence in what he was doing. So I started going through all my old photos and, sort of then invited him round here for dinner, and he came round and did a second load of, we'd done this kind of formal, to camera interview just in a hotel room. But then we did a second thing where I just pulled loads of things out of the loft and pulled books and clothes down and chatted about stuff.
And everyone was really helpful with giving me, their own personal archives. And even though there was no footage that existed of the band, I found that even that not a challenge, not a limitation.
And Max, how did it feel when you watched the documentary back in full, particularly for a band that was together for such a short period of time?
Yeah, it was great. It was really good. It was at the Curves in Soho. It was at a big cinema. The last time I'd been in that cinema a year or so earlier had been to see Pedro Moldovar talking. So I was like, whoa, we're up here doing a post-screening Q&A on the same stage that with Pedro Moldovar had been on. Wow. And it was full, it was sold out. We'd originally been put in a smaller screen, and they had to change it to screen 1 into the biggest cinema, the Curves. And so it really felt like an occasion. So that was really fantastic. There was a lot of people there, people from the band and our friends and families and associates. Some people I hadn't seen for like literally decades. I mean, people like John Gosling, who'd been in Psychic TV and just before me, and just loads and loads of people. So it was a real sense of occasion. It was really, really lovely. Yeah, quite kind of odd. And yeah, in the film, I really liked the way that Marco used James, the person who creates perfumes, and the whole story of perfume that runs through it. I just thought was a really really nice thing to add in.
It's been getting really great feedback, great reception when I'm present at the screenings. I've had people travel from outside of the town to see the film.
It's fantastic the reception this film's got, and I was thinking, with the release of Fond Reflections and this, there's a great moment in the documentary. John Robb refers to Rema-Rema as a slice of oral archaeology.
Yeah.
And that is so perfect, I think. And there's such a truism in that, because for me, those songs and this band are the key to unlocking much of what came later. And I think the post-punk and goth landscape would be very different without Wheel and the Roses and Rema-Rema in there.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, no, obviously I'm biased on the inside,
Of course.
but I feel it does. I think it does something different to a lot of the things that were coming out at the time. It was on a different trajectory. I suppose the only sad note to the documentary premiere and everything, and the whole thing of the film is that Marco Poroni, as opposed to Marco Porsia, just chose not to be involved in the film, and that felt a little bit sad because he'd contributed to a resonance into. The five of us had met up a few years earlier and had a really lovely, which I think is out there. I think it's out there in the world. There's an interview on Resonance with all five of us, and he's in that interview. Marco spoke very highly of his time in Rema-Rema, and it was very kind of positive about. And I know that he left because he didn't want to he wanted to do something different, so that's fair enough. But when he left, there wasn't all that negativity that seemed to come much later. And I say even in 2010, in the Resonance interview, he was really kind of positive about the experience. And then suddenly, I think John Robb interviewed him at Louder Than More or something, and he was very, very negative about Rema-Rema. And then in recent times, he's just not wanted. He would not wanted to talk to any of us.
That's really sad.
I don't know. Yeah.
Is the film going to get a physical release? Is there going to be a DVD or a Blu-ray or something like that?
Yeah, it will do. Yeah, it's just doing the kind of festival circuit at the moment. It's not.
Sure.
I think the normal kind of trajectory is to do festivals for about a year or so. Try and milk that circuit as much as possible.
Yeah.
Try and get as many kind of reviews and awards and all that sort of thing before it gets distributed online. But I know it's being negotiated because Marco Porsia has done further interviews with all of us to be like extras for the.
Oh, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to hearing that and watching that.
And I'm really hoping to have a physical release because, like the record itself of Wheel and the Roses, I want a physical object to remain as an artifact. And I've got a lot of great bonus material as well. I've created a 50-minute companion piece about Chris Big and sort of the beginning of 4AD, told through his artwork and the artwork that he did for the Wolfgang Press, and also other little featurettes on Renegade Soundwave and Psychic TV, which were the other bands that the band members went on to be in. And I also have this great one-off performance that happened in the festival Siu Sound in Torino, where Gary Asquith and McAllen of Rema-Rema performed the Wheel and the Roses EP live for the first time in 43 years alongside the band Larsen. So we've captured that, and so there's a lot of amazing stuff that I'd love people to see, and I'm hoping to find a distributor for it, and who knows, hopefully maybe even 4AD might be interested in putting it out. We'll see.
4AD, if you're listening, you're probably not. Put it out, because Marco and Rema-Rema deserve that. We're going to hear from Marco now about how this film has opened the door to other Rema-Rema fans.
So I always thought I might be the only one who knows about this record because it was so obscure, and often you think, oh, there's no one else in the world or that knows of this band or of this record. That's how I felt back then. And but to this day, since having done the film, I've been discovering so many people that like me, have a love of that record ever since it came out. Everybody I interviewed in the film was a huge Rema-Rema fan. I know Thurston Moore is a big Rema-Rema fan. And funnily enough, on my trip to LA recently, I met up with the band Drab Majesty, and I was telling them about the film I did, and sure enough, they go, "Oh my God, yeah, we love Rema-Rema. We've had that record for a long time. We've been obsessed with that record." Both members were huge fans.
Anna Graham, great to hear. Drab Majesty, fantastic band. If you don't know Drab Majesty, they really are, I think, the leading lights of contemporary post-punk revivalism, combining songwriting finesse with atmosphere in spades. Brilliant stuff. Max, I could talk to you all day. I really could. This has been fantastic, but I'm aware I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you've got to dash off to London this afternoon. But let's try and sum this up, pull it all together. Let's talk about what you're doing now, because I know you're still teaching a little bit and you've been involved with some street theatre. So let's pull it together. Talk about what you're doing these days and how creativity is still part of your life.
I've just retired, actually, after 25 years or more of running a company that did outdoor arts, street theatre, but also cabaret and loads of other things. So first of all, obviously starting out as a performer, but in more recent years, we're more focusing on kind of choreography and directing and kind of emceeing and DJing, like that. Yeah. But yeah, I was running a company that I've just retired from in the last year.
Still doing stuff though?
Yeah, still doing a little bit. I've done a few little kind of installations and kind of spoken word and sound art things. I mean, if I do make anything these days, it tends to be more kind of quieter, more low key stuff rather than whizzing around the country with loads of trucks and transits and stuff like that. And I'm writing the next book.
You are, yeah. How have you found that in comparison to the first one?
Yeah, some of it was kind of half started anyway, because when I was first doing 69 Exhibition Road, I didn't know it was going to be called 69 Exhibition Road. It was going to be just framed by that. I kind of thought maybe I'd be writing about playing in bands. So I'd already done some writing about psychic TV and things like that, which is like mid 1980s. It's all right. I think it's close to being a solid first draft, so it'll go to the publisher soon to see what they think, but there's still lots of work to do on it. But it's kind of picking up from leaving 69 Exhibition Road. So it's at the moment it's running 1982 to 1992, so it just edges into the beginning of the 90s. There's various reasons for that, but it just starts and stops where it needs to, although the publisher might think differently, so it might get pared back. I don't know, we'll see. Yeah, so it covers the time in psychic TV. It covers becoming a mother for the first time. It covers the whole strange life, ballroom dancing and teaching for Arthur Murray's, and lots of other stuff. It's quite an odd mix, but then I think 69 Exhibition Road was as well.
And actually, that leaves the door nicely ajar. If you wanted to come back and do this again in a year's time, I'd love to have you back on here and discuss the 80s with you, because there's so much I could ask you.
Yeah, well, I'll come back and talk about the 80s.
That would be awesome. I would love that, Max. So, last question then, and this is something I ask everyone in some guise or another. Creativity. What keeps creativity flowing for you? What drives you to kind of indulge your creativity?
In a lot of ways, I don't feel there's ever been a choice. I haven't sort of decided to be creative. I've just done things.
Sure.
Sometimes I'm a little bit envious of people who are just really good at one thing, like they're brilliant at playing the violin, so they become a concert violinist and that's just what they do. Whereas I've done lots of things. Dancing and writing are the two that have been the longest threads. But there's also theatre making and installation making, journalism. Along the way, I DJ. I've got a radio show. So I flit around from one thing to another, and bit of a dilettante kind of thing. And I don't know. I don't really know if that's. I don't know what I think about that really. As I say, sometimes I think, oh, if I just did one thing, maybe I'd just do it really well, and that'd be really brilliant, and I wouldn't need to keep zipping around. But I do seem to just zip around.
Well, that kind of goes back to the punk thing you were talking about earlier, and this has come up in other podcasts as well. It's about doing it for the passion, not waiting for permission and just having a go.
Well, I think some people are more driven by just one thing and wanting to do that one thing really, really well. And I think other people like me are more driven by the idea of ideas, playfulness, and just trying out new things. So I think that's what's been driving me, just curiosity to do things I haven't done before.
I think that's a really nice way to end this, Max. So I will say thank you very much for being on.
Oh, thank you. Are you called Jay or Jonathan or both?
I'm called Jonathan to my mum, but Jay to everybody else.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I've been emailing you as Jay.
It's Jay, yeah.
I always try and look and see how people sign themselves.
Well, thank you very much, Max. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and this has been great fun. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, just send me a link when it's going out somewhere.
I certainly will, yeah. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Safe journey.
Lovely to meet you. And
love to.
Yeah. All right, lots of love.
Yep. Take care. Bye, Max. Bye. Another episode in the can, episode number 5 now. That was really good fun, and it's a bit of an experiment, this, dropping in a special guest as well in the form of Marco Porsia, who directed the Rema-Rema film, What You Could Not Visualise. So great to hear that's going to get a physical release, and hopefully it'll come back round to the UK soon. He's actually in Europe, Marco, touring this at the moment. He's in Poland at the moment, I believe. Fantastic to hear stories from Max from that time, setting the scene for what London was like on the ground as punk was happening, and then, things darkened, post-punk began to appear, and then goth as well. Really, really enjoyed this episode. Next one will be a little while later on from this. I'm moving house, which is very exciting, but also quite stressful. So I think I'm going to take a break from this for a few weeks while I recalibrate, and we will be in a new home after that. But in the meantime, I've got my next chat with Trey Bell over at Arcane Frequencies. We're going to be talking top 10 current 93 albums. That'll be a special episode that I'll put up, and it'll also be on film, so keep an eye on the YouTube channel for that one. But if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, spot the dog, pin the tail on the donkey, whatever it is social creatures do. But great fun this. I'm really, really enjoying it, and I hope you are too. So big thank you to Max Prior, and thank you to Marco Porsia for being on this episode with me. This is New Musical Chairs. Thank you.